We'll leave the National Press Club there. The joint presentation from News Corp's Michael Miller, Nine Media's Hugh Marks and the ABC's David Anderson, a joint presentation on media freedom there, hosted by Sabra Lane at the National Press Club in Canberra. I want to go now to follow up on all this to Peter Greste, former journalist, now journalism academic and the national spokesperson for the new Alliance for Journalist Freedoms. Thanks for joining us again, Peter. You've been pushing for this sort of action. Obviously, slightly different perspectives from the different media leaders there. I suppose Michael Miller seemed to be the one who had the most prescriptive approach, didn't he? He had a very clear idea of the actions he would like to see taken, the laws he'd like to see passed. What did you think of that shopping list from him?
Yeah, no, I thought that was pretty strong. And in fact, you won't be surprised to hear that that list is actually quite close to a lot of the recommendations that we've made in the white paper that the AJF published, actually about a month ago, a few weeks before the raids took place. And so these are the kinds of things, in fact, that we've been calling for, things like a right to contest search warrants, public sector protection for public sector whistleblowers, a review of the way that classified information is marked secret, a review of defamation law, a review of
freedom of information laws as well. Yeah, there's a lot there.
Yeah, I mean, all of these things. Look, Chris, I think the key point is this: and we saw this coming from a lot of those gentlemen, that there seems to be an overall culture of secrecy that's crept into government. Which I think has undermined the really important parts, or the fundamental transparency that you need to make this stuff work. And I think that came through loud and clear, that nobody up there, I think, wanted to damage national security for its own sake. But at the same time, they all recognised and emphasised the really important need to drive a culture of transparency, which we seem to have lost in recent years.
Yeah, Hugh Marks, I think, used the old boiling frog analogy, and he's suggesting that over recent years there have been so many tranches of national security legislation have come in, and that each step along the way didn't seem dramatic in itself. But now we're in a situation where the bias is skewed a bit, if you like. Now, there's always going to be this bias, and governments need to keep secrets. The media's bias is always towards transparency, but there does seem to be there's very much a united front from the media saying that's gotten out of skew of late. But interestingly, on this program in recent weeks, I've interviewed both Jim Molan, of course, a former Major General in the Australian Army, and a couple of others who have actually said that they do believe there is a problem in government with the overclassification of material.
Yeah, in fact, I've been speaking to a couple of security insiders as well from within government, and they've also, and I really wasn't expecting it. You know, when I was having these conversations, I thought that I'd end up with some pushback, that I'd have to argue much more forcefully. I thought that I'd be hearing from them a very forceful defence of national security, of the need for secrecy in the digital age, and so on. But in fact, I heard the opposite, that there genuinely seems to be a generalised acceptance that there is too much classification, that stuff is routinely described as classified. And I often think that that's more because, as a civil servant, you're much more likely to get into trouble by letting something go out that shouldn't go than you are by overclassifying.
Absolutely.
So the tendency is always going to be...
Yeah, simple butt covering. That's what you're going to do. You're going to...
exactly.
The risk is on the downside,
And that's why I think, and as we heard in those comments earlier too, that there needs to be a much clearer definition, much clearer lines around what can be marked classified and what is not classified, and also to make it much easier for the civil servants to understand where those lines are and not to cross those lines. But there also needs to be a default position of transparency, unless there is a very clear cost to national security, unless there is a clear risk associated with this information possibly being leaked, then there needs to be an acceptance that it could well go out, that it shouldn't be classified.
Now, we mentioned that big shopping list there. It even includes defamation law, and there's been some very, very controversial and high-profile defamation trials and outcomes of late. So reform there is very complicated as well, involves state and federal law. I suppose what you end up, though, is this debate that I think some of the questioning focused on, and that is, how can the media push for all of this relaxation, I suppose, on media controls, whether it's the anti-terror laws, whether it's the right to contest search warrants, whether it's reform of defamation laws or freedom of information, when the media has such a problem with trust itself? I mean, this is an issue for the media. The media needs to make sure that the public has trust in the media in order to ask for more trust and transparency to be given it from government.
Yeah, and I think, I've forgotten who it was, I think it might have been Michael Miller who acknowledged that there is a trust deficit, or Hugh Marks, acknowledged that there is a trust deficit, acknowledged that we're never going to be able to get the media freedom that we really need without public support. And I completely agree with that. I think that we have, as an industry, tended to let our standards slip. But I also think we need to remind our audiences, remind the public of what the world would look like without a free media. You know, if we didn't have a free media, if we relied purely on the Facebook posts and Twitter feeds of our politicians and senior civil servants for our information of what was going on in government, then I think things would be pretty grim indeed. So there are these two messages. We do need to sort out our standards. I think that we've become too focused on trying to produce commercial products, and I actually disagree that simply making things commercial means that we end up, or producing stuff that people are willing to pay for means that we end up with better quality, because I think there is a tendency also to push towards the sensational, towards the polemic, which tends to draw people in. I don't necessarily think that leads to quality. But, and so we need to focus very solidly on the good old-fashioned traditional values of solid journalism, of accuracy, of integrity, of independence, of balance and so on. If we do that, then I think we're likely to win the trust back, the public trust back, and we'll have a much stronger case to make when it comes to arguing for these kinds of protections in government. Yeah,
I agree with you on all of that, although I think the other point is there needs to be consistency. The media as a whole, I mean, there's always going to be 1,000 different points of view, as there should, but as a whole, the media bias should always lean towards freedom of expression and in a myriad of debates. And we're seeing that at the moment now. Well, we saw in recent years a lot of people in the media support de facto regulation of the print media, probably on partisan grounds. We're seeing a lot of people in the media now supporting, I suppose, the crushing political correctness that's seen Israel Folau have his contract terminated. I mean, the media ought to be careful. If we want all this more freedom, more transparency from government, our natural bias always should be arguing for freedom of expression.
Yeah, of course. Look, you're right, and we need to make sure that we're fairly unified on those sorts of issues too. But let's also not get distracted from what's at stake here. We have a responsibility. We have certain responsibilities that we have to live up to as the media. But at the same time, those responsibilities are meaningless if we also don't have the legislative freedoms to actually operate, to hold government to account, and to do our jobs, the jobs that those guys so articulately laid out.
Yeah, now Michael Miller's put out that
government to account.
That shopping list. Some of that can be dealt with legislation. Some of it actually is asking for reviews of certain areas. He wants the government to get cracking. What chance do you see of the government taking up some of these issues, or what about the other alternative that has been suggested, a parliamentary committee that starts trawling through all of this and will obviously take some considerable time?
Well, yeah. Chris, there are a couple of things. At the moment, there seems to be two ideas on the table. It certainly seems, I think, that the government is willing to take some kind of action. I think that these kinds of debates have shown that there is a need to act. We have heard, and the feedback that I'm getting from within the civil servants is that there is an appetite or recognition of the need to change things. And so I think there is some kind of momentum for some kind of action. This stuff isn't simply going to go away. But the key is the kind of action. Now, at the moment, there's talk of a commission, of an inquiry into the legislation, and I think that would be the wrong step, because what commissions tend to do, what inquiries tend to do, is become oppositional. They tend to simply entrench positions. They're also seen often as attempts to simply kick these issues into the long grass. They produce recommendations, and then often those reports and recommendations go nowhere. And so they don't really end up solving the problem. What we really need, I think, is a much more focused task force whose job is to come up with a series of changes, recommended changes, Task force, by definition, are much more collaborative. They're able to find a middle ground, able to reconcile differences, bring people together in a way that's much more collaborative. And I think if we see something like that, if we see a genuine commitment from the government to produce a task force that has the right kind of mix of its members, of its membership, that has a reasonable time frame, not too far off that this thing simply disappears into the dim, distant future, but is also gives them enough time to actually conduct the work that's necessary, and gives them a mandate to come up with recommended changes that the government will seriously consider and do everything they can to enact, then I think people will start to take this process seriously. They'll start to believe that the government is serious about protecting press freedom.
Thanks, Peter. Lots to go on with there, but that sounds like a pretty good approach. Peter Greste there joining us from Brisbane. Thank you.